Hi, I'm Niall Joan Rivers, and today I'm going to teach you about different types of decks in Magic the Gathering. When you sit down to play a game of Magic, it's very common for people to start describing their decks. They might say, I have an aggro deck, I have a combo deck, a mid-range deck maybe. And those words might not mean anything to you. All of these are different terms that we use to describe deck archetypes. There are many different deck archetypes in Magic. Within those archetypes, there are sub-archetypes. Even two decks of the same archetype might look very different, but having these terms and descriptive phrases helps us to quickly communicate what kind of deck we're playing and what it is ultimately trying to do when we sit down to play with our friends. So first and foremost, we're going to go over some of the more general deck archetypes, and then we're going to get into some of the more commander-specific archetypes. So first up on our list, we have aggro. Aggro decks are aggressive. They want to usually play creatures early, start attacking immediately, and put damage on the board as soon as they can. They want to be dealing damage as quickly and repeatedly as they can, and their plan is to win the game very quickly. Now, the benefit to a deck like this is you can win the game very quickly. A lot of aggro decks can win the game on turn 2, turn 3, sometimes even turn 1. The downside is, if someone is able to survive far beyond that, your deck becomes less and less effective as the game goes on. So while you might be extremely powerful in the first few turns, as the game gets later and later, your power level falls off dramatically. I think the poster child of aggro decks has got to be mono red decks. They are known for their cheap creatures and highly effective damage spells, such as Lightning Bolt, one of the most famous Magic cards of all time. This is 1 red mana to deal 3 damage to any target. This means it can hit any of your opponent's creatures, their planeswalkers, or even your opponent directly. And getting to deal 3 damage for 1 mana is extremely cost effective. They also use creatures such as Monastery Swiftspear. This is again a 1 red mana card, and it is a 1/2 with haste and prowess. And prowess is an ability that gives the creature +1/+1 till end of turn every time you cast a non-creature spell. So you can see how these kind of work together to where you can play your cheap prowess creature, and then you can hit your opponent with lightning bolts, or maybe clear the way by hitting one of their creatures with a lightning bolt, and that just makes your Monastery Swiftspear hit harder, and you play enough of these very cheap but very efficient threats, and suddenly your opponent runs out of life. Next up, let's talk about a deck archetype that's kind of the opposite of aggro, and that is control decks. Now, control decks are all about exactly what it sounds like, control. They want to control the game, they want to control what cards you play, when you play them, what the board looks like, what creatures live and die, all of that. Control wants to dictate everything about the game. And just how with aggro, we were strongest in the first few turns, but then fell off completely, control is almost an inverse of that, where in the first few turns, control usually doesn't have a lot to do, but as the game goes on farther and farther, control becomes more and more powerful. And if you're in a position where you are in late game, like turns 10 or farther, against a control deck, you're probably in a pretty bad spot. There are tons of different control decks, but I think the best one to look at to really communicate the point has got to be blue-white decks, or Azorius as they are known. Azorius control decks are very powerful because they get all of the counter magic of blue and all of the highly efficient and also exile removal of white. And there's just been so many highly effective Azorius control cards printed over the lifetime of Magic the Gathering that it makes for a very scary deck. Some Azorius staples that you will see in these decks are cards like Dovin's Veto, a 2 mana uncounterable counterspell. You will see all kinds of board wipes, cards like Sunfall, which exiles all the creatures on the board, cards like Supreme Verdict, which is uncounterable and destroys all creatures, cards like Farewell, which can get rid of just about everything that's in play. As you can see, these cards are all a lot more expensive than the cards we were looking at for aggro decks, but they're also much more impactful. Back when we were looking at aggro, we had cards that only cost 1 mana, but they dealt 3 damage. Now we're looking at cards that can cost upwards of 6 mana, but they completely neutralize the board once they are played. And that is sort of how Control is able to win the late game. Once the aggro deck has run out of steam, the Control deck, every card that they're drawing is just such higher value than the cards that the aggro deck are drawing. Next up, when we're talking about just general deck archetypes, is mid-range decks. Now mid-range is pretty interesting because it's kind of like if the aggro deck and the Control deck had a baby. Mid-range decks really are sort of aggro Control hybrids. They are known for having very efficient and effective spells on the low end of their curve, but also still having very impactful spells on the high end of their curve. Now, I know this kind of sounds like there are no downsides and why wouldn't you just play mid-range decks all the time? But the issue with mid-range decks is you're kind of playing two halves of two different styles of decks, and sometimes you just draw the wrong half of the deck at the wrong time. Imagine a game where you're up against an aggro deck and you're just drawing all of your late game pieces early. You have no way to stop this onslaught that they're sending at you, and you just get crushed. Or you're up against a Control deck and you're just not able to get out any of your aggression in time, and they're still stronger than you in the late game, so you get beat. Where they really shine is when the right cards come at the right time, and they're kind of able to play both sides of the field and do well against the aggro decks and do well against the Control decks. Overall, mid-range decks are very reliable, but their margins are smaller. While aggro decks are able to beat you quickly and severely, and Control decks are able to just dominate in the late game, mid-range decks are more likely to just sort of win by like turn 6 or 7 in a less flashy way than either of those decks, and in a less guaranteed way than either of those decks. But in general, they are just positioned well against a lot of things, assuming they don't draw the wrong half of their deck. I think the most classic example of a mid-range deck is probably Jund mid-range, and Jund is just the term that we use for a deck that is red, black, and green. A great example from classic Jund mid-range decks is Liliana of the Veil. This is a mid-range staple. She is a 3-mana planeswalker. As soon as she enters the battlefield, you can either increase her loyalty to make each player discard a card, or decrease her loyalty to make target player sacrifice a creature. And if you get Liliana up high enough in loyalty, you can eventually do her -6 ability, where you get to separate all your opponent's cards into 2 piles, and then make them pick which pile of cards they keep, and then they have to sacrifice the rest. Another example that I think really illustrates what mid-range wants to do is Kolaghan's Command. This card is very versatile in that there are 4 different options on it, and you get to choose 2 of them when you cast it. This makes it very flexible, which makes it very appealing to mid-range decks, because it means when you're up against the aggro piles, maybe you're more likely to be dealing damage to creatures. Whereas when you're playing it against a Control deck, maybe you're more inclined to make them discard a card or return a creature from your graveyard. Overall, this really just shows what mid-range wants to do. They want to play cards that have multiple options, that are flexible, that have high payoffs, so that they can just use them in any situation and make the card work for the given game. You can kind of think of mid-range as like a jack of all trades, master of none. It is not specialized in any one part of the game, but it's pretty good at all parts of the game. All right, last on our list of very generic deck archetypes is combo decks. A combo deck is a deck that uses some combination of cards to do something repeatedly, over and over, sometimes infinitely, sometimes less than that. Sometimes combos are what we call deterministic, which means there's only one end result of the combo no matter what happens. Sometimes they are not deterministic, which maybe means you are having to draw cards off the top of your deck, and the order in which you draw them could change how the combo plays out. But effectively, they're all just decks that have these pieces that work kind of like an engine together and are able to loop through different game actions and make different things happen. Some classic combo deck examples are Lotus Field, which takes advantage of a land called Lotus Field, which can tap for 3 mana of any color, which you can then use in conjunction with cards like Hidden Strings, which only cost 2 mana, but allows you to untap permanents. So you can effectively gain mana by casting this with Lotus Field on the table. Eventually what they try to do is amass enough mana of different colors that they are able to play something like Omniscience, so that now all of their cards are free. So that's basically the gist of combo decks. They are trying to build this engine and amass all these parts to where they get to do something that is very difficult for you to stop once they start. Okay, so those are all of the general deck archetypes, or at least kind of the main 4. Now let's talk about some of the EDH specific deck archetypes that you might hear. First up, we'll talk about Typal decks. Typal decks are decks that are focused around a certain type of creature. Classic examples of this are elf decks, goblin decks, or my personal favorite, merfolk decks. The thing with Typal decks is they're highly synergistic. A lot of the creatures will reference creatures of that type. It is very easy to get a wide board of elves or goblins or fairies or whatever and make them all stronger because they're making each other stronger and having a bunch of powerful effects for having a bunch of creatures of the same type. Generally speaking, the problem with Typal decks is they are very weak to board wipes. Usually they need to snowball and get a lot of creatures of their type on the board, and it can be hard to rebuild that if you just wipe it all away. Another deck type that you will hear in EDH is Voltron. A Voltron deck is a deck that is trying to make one very strong creature, usually by attaching enchantments and equipment to it. In EDH specifically, this is very common to make your commander the Voltron creature. The reason for this is so they can make their commander very strong and difficult or impossible to block, and then kill people with commander damage, because once you take 21 points of damage from any given commander, you lose the game regardless of how much life you had left. So this is highly effective, especially against decks that are trying to gain a bunch of life and stall you out to the late game, because you can still just kill them with commander damage. Now, Voltron decks are very susceptible to targeted removal, and this is why a lot of their Voltron pieces, they will include things that make creatures hexproof, which means your opponent can't target them with spells or abilities, or even give them Shroud, which means no one, including you, can target them with spells or abilities. But basically, you can consider Voltron decks a little bit of a glass cannon. If you can deal with the one problem they are presenting, you're probably fine. Next up, we're going to talk about Stax decks. Now, Stax decks are very interesting because they are EDH specific, but they're also sort of taboo to play in EDH. Stax decks are effectively control decks, but specifically what they are trying to do is stop you from playing the game and stop your cards from working. A great example of a Stax piece is Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. She doubles all of the abilities of permanents you control entering the battlefield, but she prevents the abilities of opponents' permanents from triggering when they enter the battlefield. One of the more frustrating examples of a Stax piece in EDH is Drannith Magistrate. This is a 2-mana creature that says that your opponent can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hand. Now, this is extremely oppressive in EDH specifically because your commander lives in the command zone, which, as you will note, is not your hand. So this is a creature you can get out as early as turn 2 or even turn 1 sometimes, and it stops everyone else from being able to play their commander. And that's kind of the heart of what Stax wants to do. It wants to stop everyone else from playing their cards, from their cards having any effect. that kind of thing. They want to lock you out of the game and then defeat you. That's why this is sort of taboo to play in casual EDH, because people like to play their cards. People like to play their commanders. This is why they built their decks. Now, if your play group likes Stax decks, that's great. Maybe just don't bring them to random groups at FNM. But finally, we're going to talk about something that is sort of the opposite of a Stax deck, and that is a group hug deck. Now, this is a deck that has a bunch of effects that are good for the whole table. Maybe they let everyone draw a card. Maybe they let everyone make a treasure token, things like that. Now, the thing with group hug decks is they are really just lying about their threat level. They are trying to convince everyone else at the table that you want to keep them around, right? Why would you want to kill me? I'm letting you draw cards. Why would you want to kill me? I'm giving you creature tokens. I am a valuable asset at the table for you. But generally, every time they're letting you draw a card, they're drawing 2 cards. When they're giving you a treasure token, they're getting treasure tokens. They're sitting back, letting everyone else fight each other, pretending to be everyone's friend, and then when the moment comes, they will strike and they will take you down. So these are just a handful of the different types of decks that we see in Magic. And really, there are kind of countless numbers of different decks. You hear about combo control, you hear about storm decks, you can get very granular with what you call your deck, but these 8 different deck archetypes pretty generally cover most of what you're gonna see at a table. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, comment, subscribe, all those great things. Also, thank you to all these supporters on Patreon, which get access to these videos early. You can find a link to that down below. Also, thank you to our sponsor, Heavy Play. If you're unfamiliar with Heavy Play, they make really cool products for Magic the Gathering. They are magnetic, they stick together, they're just really fun and satisfying to use. You can find a link to their products down below, and if you use code Nile at checkout, you'll get 10% off your entire order. Anyways, I hope you found this helpful. Let me know down below if you did. If there's anything else that you would like me to cover in this series, please let me know about that as well, and I will be more than happy to make a video on it. Bye! LOL, lots of love!